It's very important to grasp this particular pair of readings, the Gita and the Bible together, and what they really mean. The heading here is, intuition is simple, the intellect is complex, or the intellect is complex, intuition is simple. And it's not a statement that is necessarily obvious. And it's also a statement that can be easily misunderstood. I mean, we live in a culture in which intellect is highly prized. We live in an area in which intelligence is sort of the coin of our progress through our careers and whatever it is that we're trying to do. Intelligence is highly prized where we live now and the way that we live. And in fact, we have to have it. We have to have a very highly developed intellect these days in order to be able to sift through all the confusing input that comes to us, all the overwhelming amount of information. It's not a society designed for just sort of wandering through the hillsides. There was a little girl at Ananda village who was very spiritually inclined when she was a young child, and she read a number of stories. Her mother, in order to encourage her spirituality, read her stories and gave her stories about some of the child visionaries who were in the Catholic Church above all, especially Saint Bernadette and the children of Fatima. And in both cases, these were shepherd children. They went out with their goats or with their cows, and then while they were out in the fields was the time when they had their experiences of Divine Mother coming to them. I guess Bernadette was not... She was a simple child. They didn't have animals because they lived in the city. But nonetheless, she was out in the countryside gathering wood, doing simple tasks. So this little girl, who was about 8 at the time, decided that her true ambition in life was to realize God. It seemed that people who just lived simple lives out in the country were the ones who had the best chance of having these visions. So she announced that she was not going to school anymore. She just couldn't see any reason why it would help her in her chosen profession, which was to be a visionary. Now, there is a certain amount of truth in that. Her mother worked hard to persuade her to go back to school, and in fact, she did successfully complete her education. But there is a certain amount of truth in it. What is our chosen profession? Almost all of us in this day and age have to have professions in which we can read, write, run computers, do math, a whole lot of very basic things, and far, far beyond that as a rule. When I was here not too many weeks ago, I was talking about Ananda Ma, who is written up in Autobiography of a Yogi as the joy-permeated mother. She is indeed one of the great religious figures of our time. She died in 1982, so now it's been some years since she passed away, but still she's a modern person. She could neither read nor write, and when she signed her name, she would put a dot. But in her case, her profession chose her. From earliest childhood, she was in a state of mystical communion. And for her to have learned to read and write would have been to bring her consciousness down to a much less exalted state of awareness, where things would be known by their symbols rather than actually perceived directly. So what we're talking about when we talk about intellect and intuition is we're talking about intuition's capacity to know the truth from direct experience. It's not because anyone tells us. In fact, in the Bible, one of the really fantastic passages, which is used by the Catholic Church to justify the legitimacy of their whole institution, but that's not how Yogananda interprets it. Jesus asks his disciples, "Who do you think I am?" And they propose various names of other previously living prophets, which interestingly is by inference a reference to the fact that they all talked about reincarnation without hesitation. Because Jesus doesn't correct them. You were Jeremiah, you were this prophet, you were that prophet. What that means is in a previous lifetime you lived as that prophet. And Jesus just accepts that without saying, "Oh, no, it's not church dogma to talk about reincarnation," which is what would be said now. But then Peter says, Simon, he was called then, or Simon Peter, "Thou art the Christ, thou art the living God." And Jesus says to him, "Thou art Peter, which means thou art a rock of divine understanding, because no man has told you this. This is not something that came to you by someone else using words to describe a state of consciousness, and then you could say, it's true. All the evidence definitely points to that. He's raised the dead, he's walked on water, he's turned water into wine, he uplifts my spirit, therefore, he may in fact be the Son of God. But that's not why Peter answered. Peter answered because in communion with Christ, he simply knew it. He knew that this was the manifestation of divinity in front of him without any limit, and he had absolute confidence in that perception, and so he declared it. And then Jesus said, upon this rock of divine realization, I can build my church. And the church he meant was the church of the consciousness that I have. I can turn your being into a temple. I can make you a sacred vehicle, because not only have you had the subtlety to perceive directly the reality around you, but you also have the courage to declare it. Now, later in Jesus' life, toward the end of his life, he did a little bit of house cleaning of his disciples. Swami Kriyananda tells us that in the last years of Paramhansa Yogananda's life, it was almost as if Master, as we call him, Yogananda, made it as difficult as possible for the disciples to stay with him. He put tests in front of them. He didn't explain himself. He behaved in a challenging manner. And many people who had been there with Yogananda decided it was time for them to go on. And later, Master explained to Swami Kriyananda that he had, in fact, the Divine Mother was cleaning house. Now this was because Yogananda was about to die. And while he was there, he could sort of hold together a lot of the weaker links. His own magnetism was strong enough to sort of hold them in line and move them forward. But he knew that after he was gone, the ashram needed to be strong and clear and steady, without the aid of his physical presence to make that happen, so they could go forward with the work that was given to them. It wasn't that Yogananda abandoned those other disciples. He just had to move practically through establishing his work in this world. So at the end of Jesus' life, when he knew what was coming, he knew this tremendous challenge to their commitment and their understanding of the life of Christ was going to be imposed upon them by the crucifixion and then subsequently by the resurrection. But there would be the crucifixion to go through first. And he knew that he needed to have the disciples who were going to carry on his work needed to be absolutely strong in their inner understanding, because you see, all outer support was going to be taken away from them. Now there was sort of, Jesus was there, he was the fulcrum, the point of controversy, but all the disciples could stand behind him. And Jesus himself could take the brunt of the attack from the corrupt priesthood, from the doubts of others, and they could all sort of say, go, Jesus, but they didn't have to really stand in the front and take it themselves. But after he was gone, he knew that they would. So he started making it difficult for them, and most famous of his remarks is he declared to his disciples, you must eat my body and drink my blood. Yogananda later interpreted that to mean that his body was the infinity of all creation, which was the Om. It wasn't the little physical body that he was identified with. He was far transcended that. He was all of creation, which was the Om vibration. And to eat something is to take it in and make it your own, isn't it? To convert yourself into that, to convert it into you. So his body was the Om, and his blood was the awareness of the Christ, of the divinity of all of us, coursing through his veins. And to drink it again is to make it your own. Since then, it's been made ritualistic. The body is the wafer, the blood is the wine, but the memory that they're trying to put forward is to absorb his consciousness. But he simply declared, eat my body, drink my blood. The Bible says, the disciples said to one another, this is a hard teaching. Now think about it. If Swami Kriyananda just declared to us, you must eat my body and drink my blood, You know, in the midst of a lecture, you can see how he would do it. He would be talking about the consciousness, about perhaps himself as an instrument of master, and he said, you must absorb this consciousness, you must eat my body and drink my blood. And he doesn't go on to tell us symbolically what that means. He just declares it as a challenge. We could easily say to one another, this is a hard teaching, right? And then the Bible says, and from this day many walked with him no more. Because they just couldn't absorb it. Again, you could see people saying, well, Kriyananda's just gone way too far, you know? Or Yogananda's gone way too far. I think I'll go find an easier path, right? Now, Jesus was driving them away. Now, what happened was that those who were able to stay were able to feel within that seemingly confusing, almost nonsensical teaching. Intuitively, they understood to absorb his consciousness, to absorb his flow of energy. Now, what's so interesting about this is that the way Swami explains this later is he says the challenge was not about Jesus, because the disciples who were close to him had had those years of contact with him, and they had had many, many deep experiences of the truth, of the validity of the teaching. Now, those experiences don't always come from saying, well, we sat and meditated for 45 minutes, and then he said this certain prayer, and the words of this prayer meant this, and so when I understood those words of the prayer, then I felt uplifted. What happens is, we just are in the presence of Spirit. And in those moments, we don't reason out even why I feel this way, and often there is no particular reason. It just comes upon us. But when we have that experience, we know it directly. And there's no doubt about it. We just know that it's true. Often what happens actually is that afterwards, intellect takes it apart and undermines it. Or somebody else will raise intellectual doubts. Well, are you sure that's really how you felt? Perhaps it was because you've been fasting for a while. Maybe it was just the effect of the fresh air. Perhaps somebody was hypnotizing you. You know, all these different things. And all of a sudden we say, gee, I don't know. Maybe I should be afraid. Maybe I should wait and see really how things happen. But what happened to the disciples of Jesus, the ones who stayed with him, the test was of their faith, not their faith in Jesus, really, but their faith in their own experience. You see the difference? It was their faith in themselves, which is, I have experienced who he is. Now he's challenging me. Now he's saying things I don't immediately understand, but I know what I have experienced. And I believe in the truth of my own experience. And those who had that kind of courage, and that kind of certainty, and that kind of depth, those are the ones who stayed with him. Even in the moment of crucifixion, some waffled, only John, of all the disciples, and Mary, his mother, and Mary Magdalene. Those were the only ones who followed Jesus all the way to the cross. The others became agitated by this unexpected reality that Jesus is going to be arrested and not fight back, that he's going to be condemned and not liberate himself with his miraculous powers, and then he's actually going to be nailed to the cross and he's going to die. And so they huddled away, and they weren't sure of their own experience, and they were afraid of themselves, for themselves. Afterwards, they rallied. After he had died, they came together as disciples in faith in their master, and then Jesus appeared among them. The resurrection took place to those disciples later because they did have faith, they did believe in themselves. Now, when we're talking about intellect and when we're talking about intuition, the difference here is having the knowledge so deeply and so directly that nothing can take it away from you. No amount of reason, no amount of other people's doubts, no contrary evidence that is not of the same quality. Now, in the Bible, Jesus is trying to give us an example of what that kind of certainty looks like. And he uses the example of children. Now, children are a very interesting set of teachers for us, because so much about children is exactly what we're looking for in terms of divine qualities. And so much about children has absolutely nothing to do with real divine qualities, because children are incapable of functioning in this world. You know, they don't have the developed understanding to be able to move through this world in an effective manner. They can't see, they can't use, they don't have discrimination when they need it. But what children do have is they have this trust, this accepting trust, this ability to live in the now, and this expansive joy in whatever is put in front of them, because they're not always comparing one thing to another. See, what the intellect does, it says, well, this is a good meal, you know. This is really actually quite a good meal. But the one we had before, that one was so much better. Oh, if you had only been there and been able to enjoy that one, and so on. In the introduction to Swami's book, The New Path, his autobiography, he starts by giving this little paragraph about, with Master, they saw a movie about Gyandev, who is a great saint of some centuries ago in India. And they had all been so uplifted by the movie. And then one disciple says, he speaks of a movie about Mirabai, who was another saint. Oh, he said, if you had seen that movie, you wouldn't even have liked this one. And see, that's what the intellect does, doesn't it? It's always wanting to discriminate and say one is better and the other isn't. Master's answer was, why make comparisons? And then he was speaking of the greatness of saints. He said, God plays through each one as he wants to play. But you see, isn't that just typical of what the intellect does? And it's often because we imagine that that's how to be astute. That's how to move through the world in a positive way, is always to be weighing and measuring. But you see, when we weigh and measure at all times, something always comes up lacking and something is always better. And this is why this particular passage is paired with that statement of Krishna's to Arjuna. You who are free of the carping spirit, he calls it. To you I will give my divine vision. And then because of that, Krishna reveals himself in his infinite greatness. And Arjuna has the capacity to perceive the infinity of Jesus because he is free of the carping spirit. And you think, gee, that's a mighty big reward for just not complaining, isn't it? But what he's really talking about is the ability to see things as they are. Now here's the final point on it. Saints are not stupid. This is what Sri Yukteswar says in Autobiography of a Yogi, because Yogananda describes how his training from Sri Yukteswar was very little about his spiritual consciousness. It was about the unfortunate attitude that Yogananda said he had picked up somewhere along the way, that being spiritual excused him from being attentive to the things of this world. And that Yogananda Sri Yukteswar was teaching him how to behave. And he says, spirituality is not dumbness. Saintliness is not incapacitating. Because what a highly evolved spiritual person is able to do is he's actually able to see the truth behind whatever superficial reality is in front of us. He's able not only to see that this person is confused, even unkind, even being malicious in his attitude, but behind that, there is this divine spirit longing to come out. Maybe the spiritual person can see that this painting is not really very well done. But what does it matter whether the painting is well done or not? It's not a very good painting, perhaps, but what does that have to do with my inner happiness? I don't need to be able to stand here and say, yes, it's obvious that his brushstrokes were not nearly as good as this painter over here, or it's clear that this man doesn't have any idea what he's doing in his painting. That might even be a fact. And a spiritual person may even be able to state that. Oh, look, this is a terrible painting. But the intellect makes its sense of self-worth and often its happiness dependent upon this ability to weigh and measure. And that's what Krishna calls the carping spirit. Always weighing and measuring and weighing and measuring and weighing and measuring and then deciding how I'm going to feel. You see how different that is than just having a direct perception? The intuition of a spiritual person, or the consciousness of a spiritual person, is far more perceptive, really on all levels, than the less evolved person can be, because the spiritual person is simply more aware. As Sri Yukteswar also says in Autobiography of a Yogi, he advises Yogananda. He said, people seldom say what they really mean. You must learn to discern behind the confusion of their verbiage what it is that they are really trying to convey. It's a very interesting instruction. Learn to discern behind the confusion of what people actually say to who they really are and what they mean. It's a very interesting experience with Swamiji. Oftentimes you'll make a statement to him about something that you've completely reasoned out, and this is what you think you feel, or think you think, and he'll answer you as it's seemingly like a non sequitur. It'll just be like a completely different answer, as if a different question were asked. And always, I would say almost always, because I've never done a scientific study, but almost always, certainly to my own experience, he's answering what I actually meant to say. Sometimes it takes me a while even to realize that he's answered what I meant to say. I remember one, this was too obvious though, but I was describing to him a certain experience I had in meditation, and he said back to me, "Don't be afraid." I immediately said, "I'm not afraid," but I didn't say, "I'm not afraid." I said, "I'm not afraid," sort of like that, like just totally tense with fear. But I really thought I wasn't afraid. I didn't know that I was asking him about fear. I thought I was asking him about something completely else. But he knew immediately exactly what I was saying and answered that. Now, the other reality about this is when we perceive directly, especially when we perceive on a higher level of consciousness, what we perceive is the underlying nature of this universe. And this is what highly evolved spiritual people know. They understand that even though the waves on the ocean of spirit go up and down and up and down, and sometimes they're down and sometimes they're up, that the ocean of infinite bliss is unchanging. And the advanced spiritual person perceives the ocean of bliss, even if it's moving up and down in these ever-changing waves of happiness and despair and success and failure and hope and disappointment. Now, that's what the intellect is always seeing. Oh, things are not going very well. And if we're too intellectually oriented, every time those waves rise and fall, our sense of well-being or lack of it rises and falls with it, isn't it? Isn't it so? But the equanimity of a spiritual person, based as it is on a direct perception of the unchanging presence of spirit, just lives all the time in that state of consciousness. This is the bliss, the peace that passeth understanding, the Ananda of true perception of reality. Now, isn't this a great deal what children are like? Oh, look, a stick and a rock for me to play with. Me play with this stick and rock, and then they're playing with this stick and rock. Look at this puddle, ooh, look at this puddle, look at how it plays around. Look, I can use the stick and the rock and the puddle and make mud. Just hours and hours children are there. And they're kind of dumb from an intellectual point of view, but they're having a direct perception of just the joy of being, isn't it so? And so a master can just sit quietly within himself, or even quietly within himself when everyone around him is agitated and excited about some short-term disaster or success. And he's just quietly perceiving directly. The difference between the saint and the child is that the saint could also perhaps discourse with extreme insight into what's going on with the waves, but his intuitive direct perception is of the spirit behind it. Now, this is what life is really asking of us. This is the key to happiness. The way Swamiji put it so directly once, he says, joy is not of the intellect. Joy is of the heart. And intuition is the direct perception of the calm feeling of the heart. When all the likes and dislikes, when all the yeses and nos and all the ups and downs have been neutralized by that single perception of the power behind them, then this sense of complete calmness comes over us. Because you see, what is there to be agitated about? Oh yes, we may be all of us about to die. Oh yes, we may all lose all of our savings. Oh yes, we may find ourselves alone and in ill health. And the intellect can really put all those things together and see all the problems that are going to arise. But the spiritual consciousness just understands that it's just waves on the ocean, and we'll just ride those waves up and we'll ride those waves down, and certain actions may be required of us. Spirituality is not dumbness. Sri Yukteswar actually filed lawsuits in order to protect his own property. He didn't just sit there and let unscrupulous people take what he owned away from him. He went to court and hired lawyers and argued his case, but his intuitive perception was always of the bliss behind it. If you just have the intellect, you see how lonely it is? If you just try to be intuitive and don't put out the energy to also develop your objective understanding, in both cases you limp along. But together, what an extraordinary combination. There is a quality to Swami Kriyananda's self-expression lately that I have meditated on a great deal. Through most of the years that I've known him, which is now, almost 4 decades, he's been very strong-minded and very forceful and very powerful in the way he expresses himself. And he rarely wept in public. He rarely let the depth of his own feelings show. He just masked it. Now, almost nothing, just the slightest things bring Swami to tears. And in public, he actually even sometimes says, I'm embarrassed. He says, I'm embarrassed by the way my feelings just spill over all the time. But what I think is true, because anything, any little thing that expresses God's love for us, or the poignant quality of our relationship to the divine, immediately causes him to choke up. I've observed that he can almost every time he refers to his discipleship, or to meeting Master, or to what it has meant to him to be a disciple for 60 years, or to be on this path, it's just this moment of overwhelming feeling comes to him, and he has to work hard to master himself before he can go on. Or just the story of some individual person having been touched by God. And what it occurs to me is that whereas most of us say these words, we perceive it with the intellect. Yes, I met Master and this path has been so meaningful to me. Yes, I don't know what I would have done with myself speaking personally, if I hadn't met Kriyananda in 1969, if I hadn't found this way of life. I say those things and I know what it means, but I think when Swami says those things, there is a direct experience of what they actually mean. Every so often, all of us have a direct experience of what it actually means. We perform a lot of weddings, and the couple might be very much in love, and they're all just perfectly content, having a good time, but often there's that moment where they suddenly say their vows to one another, and they can't say them. They just can't say them, because the actual meaning of what is about to happen is suddenly directly perceived, and the intellect just loses its ability to override. Isn't that dear? That's what the French saint meant when he said, if you knew how much God loves you, you would die for joy. We can say that, but when the intellect is put aside and the intuition knows that, it becomes everything to us, and there's nothing left. That's the state of consciousness that we're all working for, to really see the truth and have the truth, well, in this case, set us free.